before wedding bells and baby carriages filled every horizon, there was another path. Imagine a world where your life choices, especially for women, often boiled down to one: marriage. But what if your heart, your mind, or your circumstances pulled you in a completely different direction? For centuries, religious orders weren't just quiet places of prayer. They were dynamic centers offering a radical alternative to the expected script of life. Within their walls, individuals found avenues for learning that rivaled universities, positions of power that could influence kingdoms, and a unique brand of personal freedom. Think about this. By the 12th century, certain abbesses in Europe governed territories and held legal rights that many married noblewomen could only dream of. And it wasn't just about power. Literacy rates inside some convents far outstripped those in the secular world outside. In England, before the major religious shifts of the 16th century, well over 800 monastic houses dotted the landscape, home to many thousands who chose dedication to faith and community over traditional family life. These weren't just spiritual sanctuaries, they were often significant economic and cultural engines. Let's delve into the surprising ways these institutions offered a different kind of life. Number 9. A universe of learning when books were gold. Imagine a time when a single book could cost as much as a house, or even a farm. In the long centuries before printing presses made knowledge widely accessible, books were handcrafted treasures painstakingly copied by hand, letter by letter. For many people, especially those outside the wealthiest echelons of society or the clergy, owning a book, let alone having the time and skill to read it, was an impossible dream. Education was a rare privilege. Yet, within the stone walls of monasteries and convents, a different reality unfolded. These religious communities became vibrant centers of learning and literacy, acting as the primary guardians and propagators of knowledge for vast stretches of history. In the early medieval period, following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire around the 5th century, much of classical learning was lost or fragmented across Europe. It was largely within monastic scriptoria, dedicated rooms where monks and nuns toiled as scribes, that ancient texts were preserved. These were not just religious texts, though the Bible and writings of church fathers were central. Scribes also copied classical Roman authors like Virgil and Cicero, philosophical works, and texts on medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, which became a foundational guide for Western monasticism, actually prescribed daily periods of reading and study for monks. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was part of their spiritual duty, a way to nourish the mind as well as the soul. This institutionalized commitment to intellectual activity was almost unique at the time. Consider the sheer labor involved. A monk might spend months, even years, meticulously copying a single volume onto parchment, made from animal skins. The inks were made from natural pigments, and some manuscripts were adorned with intricate illustrations and gold leaf, turning them into priceless works of art. These scriptoria were, effectively, the publishing houses of their age. For instance, the Codex Amitinus, an enormous complete Latin Bible produced at the Wearmouth Jarrow Monastery in England in the early 8th century, required the skins of over 1,500 calves and the labor of numerous scribes over many years. Its creation was a monumental undertaking, reflecting the resources and dedication available within such communities. For women, the opportunities for education within convents were particularly significant. In a society where formal education for girls was rare and often limited to domestic skills, convents offered a path to literacy, scholarship, and intellectual development. Double monasteries, communities for both monks and nuns, often ruled by an abbess, were prominent in Anglo-Saxon England, such as those at Whitby or Barking. These institutions became centers of learning where women studied scriptures, classical literature, and even canon law. Abbess Hild of Whitby, who lived in the 7th century, presided over a community that produced at least 5 future bishops, a testament to its scholarly environment. She herself was renowned for her wisdom and counsel, sought by kings and commoners alike. Later, in the High Middle Ages, from the 11th to the 13th centuries, while universities began to emerge as new centers of learning primarily for men, convents continued to provide educational opportunities for women. Hildegard of Bingen, a German Benedictine abbess of the 12th century, stands as a towering figure. She was not only a spiritual visionary, but also a prolific writer, composer, and naturalist. Her works included theological treatises, musical compositions that are still performed today, and detailed writings on medicine and natural history. Her extensive correspondence with popes, emperors, and other influential figures shows the intellectual authority a woman could achieve within a religious order. She founded her own monasteries at Rupertsberg and Eibingen, where learning and artistic creation flourished. To produce her illuminated manuscript Sibius, a record of her visions required immense resources and skilled artisans, all within the monastic context. Monastic libraries were among the largest and most important collections of books for centuries. The library at St. Gall Abbey in Switzerland, for example, had accumulated several hundred volumes by the 9th century, an enormous collection for the time. These libraries were not static repositories. Monks and nuns borrowed books, studied them, and used them to teach novices. The very act of maintaining and expanding these collections was a scholarly endeavor. Cataloging systems were developed, and books were sometimes exchanged or copied between different monasteries, creating a network of shared knowledge. The curriculum in monastic schools typically began with the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and could extend to the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. These subjects formed the basis of a classical liberal arts education. While the primary focus was often theological, the tools of learning were broadly applicable. This education equipped members of religious orders not only for contemplation and liturgical duties, but also for administrative roles, managing the often extensive lands and resources of their communities. An abbot or abbess needed to be literate, numerate, and capable of understanding legal documents. The impact of this dedication to learning extended far beyond the cloister walls. Monks and nuns were often the teachers of the local population, sometimes running schools for children from nearby towns and villages. They advised rulers, served as diplomats, and their scholarly work contributed to developments in theology, philosophy, history, and science. Without the scriptoria and libraries of religious orders, it is hard to imagine how much of Europe's intellectual heritage from antiquity and the early medieval period would have survived. For individuals who felt a calling to a life of the mind, who yearned to read, to study, to understand the world around them, religious orders offered a unique and often the only pathway to satisfy that hunger, an alternative to a life where such pursuits might be entirely out of reach. This access to a universe of learning, at a time when books themselves were as precious as gold, was a powerful draw. Number 8. Boss level, unlocked, wielding real power without a husband. In many historical societies, a woman's power and influence were often directly tied to her husband or her male relatives. Marriage could bring status and security, but it also frequently meant subordination to a husband's authority. However, for women who entered religious orders, particularly those who rose to positions of leadership like an abbess or prioress, a different kind of power became accessible, one that was not derived from a man, but from their role within a structured, respected, and often wealthy institution. Consider the position of an abbess in a significant medieval convent. She was essentially the chief executive officer, spiritual leader, and land manager rolled into one. Many convents, like their male monastic counterparts, accumulated substantial endowments of land and property over centuries through gifts from pious donors, including royalty and nobility. An abbess was responsible for administering these vast estates, which could include farms, forests, villages, and even towns. This involved overseeing agricultural production, collecting rents and tithes, managing finances, and dealing with tenants and laborers. These were complex administrative tasks requiring considerable skill and acumen. For example, the abbesses of Gandersheim Abbey in Germany, founded in the 9th century, were imperial princesses who ruled over extensive territories, minted their own coins, and held a seat in the imperial diet, meaning they participated in the governance of the Holy Roman Empire. These women were effectively feudal lords in their own right. The legal authority wielded by some abbesses was remarkable. They could preside over their own courts, judging disputes among their tenants or within their monastic community. They negotiated with secular rulers, bishops, and other powerful figures. The Abbess of Shaftesbury in England, a wealthy Benedictine nunnery founded by King Alfred in the 9th century, was one of the most powerful women in the kingdom. She held the status of a baron, controlled significant lands, and had the right to appoint clergy to churches within her domain. Similarly, the Abbess of Las Huelgas in Spain, a Cistercian monastery founded in the 12th century, held quasi-episcopal authority, meaning she had powers usually reserved for bishops, including the authority to grant license to priests to hear confession and preach. She was exempt from the jurisdiction of the local bishop and answered directly to the Pope. These were not women operating on the fringes of society. They were central figures with recognized legal and political standing. This level of autonomy and authority was virtually unattainable for most married women of the same period. While a noblewoman might manage her husband's estate in his absence, her authority was usually derivative and temporary. An abbess, however, held her position for life, and her power was inherent to her office. She was elected by her community, or sometimes appointed by a patron, but once in office, she governed according to the rule of her order and canon law. Beyond land management and legal jurisdiction, abbesses also held significant spiritual authority. They were responsible for the spiritual well-being of the nuns under their care, guiding their religious practice, enforcing discipline, and providing teaching. This spiritual leadership was a source of considerable influence both within and outside the convent walls. Figures like Teresa of Avila in 16th century Spain, a Carmelite nun, reformer, and mystic, demonstrated immense spiritual and administrative power. She undertook the arduous task of reforming her order, founding numerous new convents based on stricter principles of poverty and prayer. Despite facing opposition, she traveled extensively, negotiated for properties, and wrote influential spiritual works that continued to be studied. Her power was not based on land or secular titles in the same way as some medieval abbesses, but on her spiritual vision and her ability to inspire and lead others. Even for nuns who did not become abbesses, life in a religious order could offer a degree of self-governance and participation in decision-making that was unusual for women at the time. Monastic communities often made important decisions collectively, or through councils of senior nuns. The day-to-day running of the convent involved various offices, such as cellaress in charge of provisions, infirmarian in charge of the sick, or chantress in charge of music, which provided opportunities for responsibility and skill development. For men, becoming an abbot or prior similarly offered a path to significant power and influence, often rivaling that of secular lords. Abbots of major monasteries like Cluny in France or St. Albans in England were figures of international importance. The Abbot of Cluny, in the 11th and 12th centuries, for instance, presided over a vast network of hundreds of priories and monasteries across Europe, making him one of the most powerful religious figures after the Pope. These abbots sat in royal councils, served as ambassadors, and their monasteries were centers of political negotiation as well as spiritual life. They managed enormous wealth, patronized art and architecture on a grand scale, and their scriptoria and libraries shaped intellectual currents. Power held by leaders of religious orders was not without its challenges and responsibilities. It required navigating complex political landscapes, managing resources prudently, and maintaining the spiritual integrity of their communities. However, the fact remains that for individuals, both men and women, who might otherwise have had limited avenues for exercising leadership or wielding significant authority based on their birth or marital status, religious orders provided a structured pathway to achieve just that. It was a way to become a key player, a decision-maker, and a leader, entirely independent of the institution of marriage. Number 7. The ultimate "do not disturb" sign for your soul. In a world often characterized by social obligations, familial duties, and the relentless pressures of survival or ambition, the call to a contemplative life within a religious order offered something profoundly different: dedicated space and time for the soul. For many, marriage and family life, while fulfilling for some, also represented a web of worldly concerns and distractions. Religious orders, by their very design, aim to minimize these distractions, creating an environment where the primary focus could be on spiritual growth, prayer, and a direct personal relationship with the divine. This was, in essence, the ultimate "do not disturb" sign. A conscious choice to step away from the noise of the world to seek a deeper meaning or connection. Concept of monasticism itself, from its earliest iterations with the Desert Fathers and Mothers in Egypt and Syria in the 3rd and 4th centuries, was rooted in this desire for withdrawal, or anachoresis, a retreat from society to pursue spiritual discipline. These early hermits and communities sought solitude in the wilderness to dedicate themselves entirely to prayer and ascetic practices, believing that such a life was more conducive to encountering God. This tradition continued and evolved into the organized monasticism of later centuries. The rule of Saint Benedict, for example, structured the monastic day around the Opus Dei, the work of God, which consisted of 8 daily services of communal prayer and psalmody. This regular rhythm of prayer, interspersed with manual labor and sacred reading, Lectio Divina, was intended to keep the mind focused on spiritual matters. For individuals with a strong spiritual inclination, this structured environment was not seen as restrictive, but as liberating. It freed them from the need to constantly negotiate the demands of secular life, concerns about inheritance, dowries, social standing, or political allegiances, and allowed them to dedicate their energies to what they considered the ultimate pursuit: the salvation of their soul and union with God. Marriage, with its inherent responsibilities towards a spouse, children, and extended family, could be perceived as a significant impediment to this kind of intense spiritual focus. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament wrote about the benefits of celibacy for those devoted to the Lord's affairs, suggesting that an unmarried person is concerned about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord, while a married person is concerned about the affairs of the world, how to please their spouse. This sentiment resonated deeply with many who chose the monastic path. Mysticism, the pursuit of a direct experiential knowledge of God, often flourished within religious orders. Figures like Meister Eckhart, a German theologian and mystic of the 13th and 14th centuries, or Julian of Norwich, an English anchoress and mystic of the 14th and 15th centuries, produced profound spiritual writings born from deep contemplation. Julian, for instance, lived a life of extreme seclusion, walled into a cell attached to a church, dedicating her life to prayer and meditation on the visions she had received. Her writings, revelations of divine love, offer deep theological insights and messages of hope, born from a life radically set apart for God. Such intense focus would have been nearly impossible to maintain amidst the typical duties of married life. Even for those not called to be mystics or great theologians, the daily routine of prayer, silence, and spiritual reading provided a consistent framework for personal spiritual development. Communal aspect also offered support, as individuals were surrounded by like-minded people on the same journey. They could learn from spiritual elders, share their struggles, and be encouraged in their faith. This was a different kind of intimacy and connection than that found in marriage, but for many it was equally, if not more, profound. The physical environment of monasteries and convents was often designed to foster contemplation. Cloisters, with their covered walkways around a central garden, provided quiet spaces for walking and meditation. Chapels and churches were built to inspire awe and reverence. The emphasis on silence at certain times and in certain places helped to reduce external stimuli and encourage inner reflection. This was a stark contrast to the often bustling, noisy, and crowded conditions of many medieval households. Furthermore, the choice of a celibate life within a religious order was often seen as a higher spiritual calling, a way of imitating Christ or the apostles. It was a sacrifice, a renunciation of worldly pleasures, including the comfort and companionship of marriage and family, for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. This ideal of spiritual athleticism, of striving for perfection through asceticism and prayer, was highly valued. For individuals who felt this calling, religious life was not an escape from something negative, but a positive embrace of a different set of values and aspirations. It is important to note that the motivations for entering a religious order were complex and varied. Not everyone who joined was driven by pure spiritual seeking. However, for a significant number, the desire for a life dedicated to God, free from the entanglements of the world, was paramount. They sought a space where their spiritual longings could be nurtured, where they could delve into the mysteries of faith, and where the rhythm of their lives would be set by prayer and contemplation rather than by the demands of spouse, children, or worldly ambition. Religious orders provided precisely that: a sanctuary for the soul, a place where one could, in a sense, hang a permanent "do not disturb" sign and focus on the interior life with an intensity rarely possible elsewhere. Number 6. Finding your tribe when family trees were complicated. In many historical periods, family was everything. Your lineage defined your status, your opportunities, and your obligations. Marriage was often a strategic alliance between families designed to consolidate wealth, property, or political power. But what if your family situation was difficult? Or what if you didn't fit neatly into the expected roles? Religious orders offered an alternative form of community, a chosen family based on shared beliefs and purpose rather than blood ties. This tribe could provide a sense of belonging, mutual support, and stability that might be lacking in an individual's biological family or in the broader social family. Consider the complexities of family life in, for example, medieval Europe. High mortality rates meant that families were often fractured by death. Children might lose parents at a young age, or spouses might be widowed multiple times. Inheritance laws, particularly those based on primogeniture where the eldest son inherited the bulk of the estate, could leave younger sons and daughters in precarious positions. Younger sons might need to seek their fortunes in the church or the military, while daughters often required a substantial dowry to make a good marriage. If a family could not provide an adequate dowry, a daughter's marriage prospects could be limited, or she might be pressured into an undesirable match. For individuals in such circumstances, a religious order could represent a secure and respectable alternative. Within the walls of a monastery or convent, members became brothers or sisters to one another. This was not just a metaphorical title. It reflected a deep commitment to communal living and mutual care. The rule of Saint Benedict, for instance, emphasized the importance of the abbot acting as a father to the community and the monks treating each other with charity and respect. This created a new kind of kinship network, one that individuals actively chose to join. For someone who had experienced loss or a lack of support within their own family, the stable and structured environment of a religious community could be incredibly appealing. The daily life in a religious order was inherently communal. Members prayed together, ate together in the refectory, worked together in the fields or scriptorium, and cared for each other in times of sickness. This shared life fostered strong bonds of friendship and solidarity. These were not relationships based on romantic love or familial obligation in the traditional sense, but on a shared spiritual journey and a common commitment to the ideals of the order. This sense of belonging to a supportive group, a tribe of like-minded individuals, could be a powerful antidote to loneliness or social isolation. For women, the sisterhood found in convents could be particularly empowering. In a patriarchal society where women's lives were often circumscribed by the authority of fathers, husbands, or brothers, the community of nuns offered a space where women lived and worked together, supporting each other and sharing responsibilities. Friendships between nuns could be deep and lasting, providing emotional sustenance and intellectual companionship. The letters of medieval nuns, for example, sometimes reveal these strong bonds of affection and mutual encouragement. This was a unique social environment where women's relationships with other women were central rather than peripheral to relationships with men. Religious orders also provided a place for individuals who, for various reasons, might not have conformed to societal expectations regarding marriage. This could include those who felt no inclination towards marriage or family life, those who had physical disabilities that might have been seen as an impediment to marriage, or those who simply had a different calling. The Beguines communities of lay religious women that flourished in Northern Europe from the 13th century onwards are a fascinating example. Beguines did not take formal vows like nuns, and they could leave the community and marry if they chose. They lived together often in beguinages, which were like small towns within a town, supporting themselves through their labor, such as weaving or caring for the sick, and dedicating themselves to a life of piety and good works. These communities offered a flexible and respected alternative for women who wanted to live a religious life without the permanent commitment of monastic vows, or who perhaps came from families that could not afford the dowry often required to enter a traditional convent. They formed their own tribes on their own terms. Moreover, religious orders often transcended social hierarchies to some extent. While noble birth could certainly confer advantages even within a monastery, the ideals of many orders emphasized spiritual equality. A peasant and a prince could, in theory, become brothers in Christ, sharing the same duties and the same simple lifestyle. While this ideal was not always perfectly realized, the monastic environment could offer a degree of social leveling not found in the rigidly stratified society outside. This created a community based on shared spiritual status rather than inherited worldly rank. The sense of belonging extended beyond the individual monastery or convent. Members of large orders like the Benedictines, Cistercians, Franciscans, or Dominicans were part of a vast international network. A monk or friar might travel from one house of his order to another in a different country and find a welcoming community there. This provided a sense of being part of something much larger than oneself, a global family united by a common rule and spiritual tradition. In a world where family ties could be both a source of strength and a source of constraint or distress, religious orders provided a meaningful alternative. They offered a chosen family, the supportive tribe, built on shared values, spiritual aspirations, and the daily practice of communal living. For many, this was a powerful draw, a way to find belonging, purpose, and lifelong companionship outside the conventional structures of marriage and lineage. Number 5. Dodge the perils of childbirth. Live to scribe another day. In the modern world, with access to advanced medical care, childbirth is a relatively safe event for most women in developed countries. But for much of human history, it was one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could go through. Before the advent of antibiotics, sterile surgical practices, and skilled obstetrical care, pregnancy and childbirth were fraught with risks of life-threatening complications, including hemorrhage, infection often known as childbed fever or puerperal sepsis, and obstructed labor. For women in pre-modern societies, the decision to marry and have children was also, implicitly, a decision to repeatedly face these potentially fatal dangers. In this context, the celibate life offered by religious orders presented a starkly practical, if often unstated, alternative, a way to avoid the perils of childbirth and significantly increase one's chances of living a longer, healthier life. Historical demographic data, though often incomplete, consistently points to high rates of maternal mortality. Estimates vary by time and place, but it would not have been uncommon for maternal deaths to range from 1,000 to 2,000 per 100,000 live births, a rate that is hundreds of times higher than in developed countries today. A woman who had multiple pregnancies, which was typical, faced these risks repeatedly. Each pregnancy was a gamble. Furthermore, even if a woman survived childbirth, she might suffer from chronic health problems as a result, such as fistulas or uterine prolapse, which could cause lifelong disability and suffering. Given these realities, it is not surprising that some women and their families might have viewed the celibate life of a nun as a safer option. While the motivations for entering a convent were multifaceted, encompassing spiritual calling, intellectual pursuits, or lack of marriage prospects, the desire to preserve one's life and health would have been a powerful, if perhaps unspoken, consideration for some. Choosing a religious life meant forgoing marriage and consequently avoiding the biological lottery of reproduction. Inside the convent, while life was not without its own hardships and health challenges such as diseases spreading in close communities, nuns were spared the specific dangers associated with pregnancy and childbirth. This biological reality had a direct impact on their life expectancy compared to their married counterparts, who experienced multiple births. While it's difficult to make precise statistical comparisons across large historical populations, anecdotal evidence and smaller studies suggest that celibate women in religious orders often lived longer, on average, than their lay contemporaries who married and bore children. They had the chance to reach old age, to develop their talents, and to contribute to their communities over many decades. Consider the life of a woman like Hildegard of Bingen, mentioned earlier. She lived to the age of 81, a remarkable lifespan for the 12th century. During her long life, she was incredibly prolific as a writer, composer, and administrator. Had she been married and subjected to the rigors of frequent childbirth, it is highly questionable whether she would have had the health, longevity, or indeed the focused time to achieve all that she did. Similarly, many other abbesses, scholars, and artists within religious orders lived to advanced ages, their lives dedicated to their work and spiritual practice, unburdened by the physical toll of repeated pregnancies. The choice of celibacy was not just about avoiding death. It was also about preserving one's physical well-being to pursue other callings. The energy and time that would have been consumed by childbearing and child-rearing could instead be channeled into study, prayer, artistic creation, teaching, or administration. For a woman with intellectual or artistic gifts, or with a deep spiritual yearning, the prospect of a life uninterrupted by the physiological demands and dangers of maternity could be profoundly attractive. She could quite literally live to scribe another day, to compose another chant, to manage her abbey's estates, or to guide her community in prayer. It is also worth noting that some women may have entered convents after experiencing the dangers of childbirth firsthand, perhaps as young widows whose husbands had died, or after losing children, or suffering debilitating complications themselves. For such women, the convent could offer a refuge and a way to live a meaningful life without facing those risks again. While religious orders promoted celibacy primarily for spiritual reasons, as a means of dedicating oneself wholly to God, the practical health benefits for women were an undeniable, if often unacknowledged, consequence. In an era when a woman's reproductive capacity was central to her societal role, but also a source of profound physical vulnerability, The option to live a celibate life within a supportive community was a significant alternative. It offered a path that bypassed one of the greatest threats to female life and health, allowing women to pursue other forms of fulfillment and contribution, and in many cases to simply live longer. This practical consideration, alongside the spiritual and intellectual attractions, undoubtedly played a role in the choices made by many women who opted for the cloister over marriage. Number 4. A safe harbor in a stormy world. Life in many historical periods could be turbulent and unpredictable. Wars, famines, plagues, political upheavals, and personal misfortunes could leave individuals vulnerable and insecure. For those seeking refuge from the storms of the secular world, whether they were widows without protection, orphans without family, women fleeing unwanted or abusive marriages, or simply people seeking a more stable and secure existence, religious orders often functioned as safe harbors. They provided not just spiritual solace, but also physical sanctuary, social support, and a degree of protection that could be hard to find elsewhere. Widows in pre-modern societies often found themselves in precarious positions. Upon the death of a husband, a widow might face economic hardship, pressure to remarry often against her will, or disputes over inheritance with her late husband's family. While some widows, particularly wealthy ones, could maintain their independence, many others, especially those with young children or limited resources, were vulnerable. For such women, entering a convent could be a respectable and secure option. It offered a community where they would be cared for, a life with purpose, and freedom from the pressures of the marriage market. Many convents welcomed widows, and some even had special provisions for them. Sometimes, these women brought their property or dowries with them, contributing to the convent's resources. But in other cases, convents provided for destitute widows out of charity. This provided a socially acceptable way for a woman to live out her remaining years in dignity and security after the loss of her spouse. Similarly, orphans or children from families unable to care for them sometimes found a home in religious orders. While not all monasteries and convents functioned as orphanages in the modern sense, many did take in children known as oblates, who were dedicated to religious life by their parents at a young age. This practice was common in the early medieval period. While the motivations of parents were varied, some were genuinely pious, others may have been seeking to unburden themselves of a child they could not support, or securing a spiritual future for a younger son or daughter. For the child, the monastery or convent provided food, shelter, education, and a structured life. For some, this was undoubtedly a better alternative than a life of poverty or neglect in the outside world. Even if not formally oblates, children might be educated in monastic schools, and some would later choose to join the order. Religious communities also served as places of refuge for women seeking to escape unwanted marriages. Arranged marriages were the norm for centuries, and often a young woman had little or no say in who she would marry. If a prospective marriage was particularly odious to her, or if she felt a strong calling to a religious life instead, fleeing to a convent could sometimes be a way out, though this was often a difficult and contested path. Once a woman had taken vows, it was generally much harder for her family to force her into a marriage. There are historical accounts of women who resisted family pressure and found sanctuary within convent walls, dedicating themselves to God rather than submitting to a marriage they did not desire. In some cases, convents provided a haven from abusive husbands, although the ability of the church to intervene in marriages was complex and limited. However, the option of a separate, protected life within a religious community existed as a potential, if not always easily accessible, escape route. Beyond these specific circumstances, monasteries and convents were often perceived as islands of relative peace and stability in a frequently chaotic world. During times of war or civil unrest, Monastic precincts, often protected by walls and regarded as sacred ground, could offer a degree of safety to those who sought shelter within them. While monasteries themselves were not immune to attack or plunder, particularly during periods of widespread violence like the Viking raids or later religious wars, they generally represented a more ordered and secure environment than many secular settlements. Their routines were governed by ancient rules. Their leadership was often stable, and their connection to the powerful institution of the church afforded them a measure of protection. This role as a safe harbor was not limited to providing physical security. Religious orders also offered a refuge from the social and economic pressures of the world. For individuals who found the competitive status-conscious nature of secular society overwhelming, or who struggled to find their place within its rigid hierarchies, the communal and spiritually focused life of a monastery or convent could be a welcome alternative. It was a place where different values prevailed, where humility and service were esteemed, and where one could, at least in theory, find acceptance regardless of worldly success or failure. Charitable activities of many religious orders also contributed to their role as safe harbors. Many monasteries and convents provided alms to the poor, care for the sick in infirmaries or hospitals they ran, and hospitality to travelers. This outward-looking service created a network of support that extended beyond their own members and benefited the wider community. For people facing hardship, religious houses were often the first, and sometimes only, places to turn for help. In countless ways, then, religious orders served as vital sanctuaries. They offered protection, stability, and a sense of community to those who were vulnerable, displaced, or simply seeking a life insulated from the harsh realities of the world outside. This function as a safe harbor made them an essential and often life-saving alternative to the uncertainties and dangers that many people faced in their ordinary lives, particularly for women and others in less powerful social positions. Number 3. Unleashing your inner artist, composer, or healer. Beyond the pursuit of scholarly knowledge or spiritual contemplation, religious orders also provided fertile ground for the cultivation and expression of a wide array of practical and artistic talents. In a world where opportunities for specialized training or creative work could be scarce, particularly for those not born into artisan guilds or wealthy patronage, monasteries and convents often functioned as dynamic centers of artistic production, musical innovation, and the practice of medicine and healing arts. For individuals with a creative spark or a calling to care for others, these communities offered a unique environment to develop and utilize their gifts, often to a very high standard. The artistic legacy of religious orders is immense. For centuries, monasteries were the primary producers of illuminated manuscripts, some of the most beautiful and enduring art objects of the medieval period. Scribes, illuminators, and miniaturists, both male and female, labored in scriptoria to create these lavishly decorated books. The intricate lettering, vibrant illustrations, and use of gold and silver leaf in works like the Book of Kells, produced by Celtic monks around the year 800, or the richly decorated manuscripts from Ottonian convents in Germany, demonstrate an extraordinary level of artistic skill and dedication. Nuns were also renowned for their fine needlework and embroidery, creating elaborate vestments, altar cloths, and tapestries that adorned churches and were highly prized. The Bayeux Tapestry, for example, while its exact origins are debated, is thought by some scholars to have been embroidered by English women, possibly in a monastic workshop, painting narrative skill and artistic execution on a grand scale. Music was integral to the life of religious orders. The daily cycle of prayer, the Opus Dei, was largely sung. This required trained choirs and individuals skilled in music. Monasteries and convents became important centers for the development of Western music. Gregorian chant, the unadorned monophonic sacred song of the Roman Catholic Church, was preserved, cultivated, and disseminated through monastic practice. Furthermore, new musical forms and compositions emerged from these communities. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess, was a remarkable composer, creating a large body of original liturgical music, including hymns, antiphons, and a morality play called Ordo Virtutum, which is one of the earliest known examples of its kind. Her music is characterized by its soaring melodies and distinctive style, demonstrating a high level of musical artistry developed within the convent environment. Monks, like Guido of Arezzo in the 11th century, made significant contributions to musical theory and notation, developing the staff notation system that is the basis of Western music today. Practice of medicine and healing was another area where religious orders played a crucial role, particularly before the professionalization of medicine and the rise of universities. Many monasteries and convents maintained infirmaries to care for their own sick members, and often extended this care to the local laity. They also cultivated physic gardens, growing medicinal herbs, and their members studied ancient medical texts, such as those by Galen and Hippocrates, which had been preserved in their libraries. Monks and nuns became skilled herbalists and practitioners of practical medicine. The rule of Saint Benedict itself explicitly states that the care of the sick is to be placed above and before every other duty. This injunction spurred the development of monastic healthcare. For example, the Hortulus, a 9th century poem by Walafrid Strabo, a Benedictine abbot, describes the medicinal plants grown in his monastery garden and their uses. Hildegard of Bingen also wrote extensively on medicine and natural healing in her works, Physica and Causae et Curae, detailing the properties of plants, animals, and minerals, and their application in treating illnesses. These texts show a sophisticated understanding of contemporary medical knowledge. While monastic medicine was often intertwined with spiritual beliefs about healing, it provided essential healthcare services at a time when few other options were available for most people. Some religious orders, like the Knights Hospitaller founded in the 11th century, were specifically dedicated to caring for the sick and pilgrims. Their hospitals, such as the one in Jerusalem, were renowned for their size and the quality of care they provided. Beyond these major areas, members of religious orders engaged in a wide variety of other skilled crafts and practical work. They were architects and builders, responsible for the construction and maintenance of their often vast and complex monastic buildings. They were farmers and agricultural innovators, developing new techniques for land management and cultivation on their estates. They were brewers, winemakers, beekeepers, and blacksmiths. This emphasis on ora et labora, prayer and work, meant that practical skills were valued and cultivated. For individuals with an aptitude for these crafts, the monastery or convent provided a context in which they could develop their talents and contribute to the self-sufficiency and flourishing of their community. In a society where one's profession was often determined by birth or apprenticeship, opportunities were limited. Religious orders offered a different path. They provided the training resources and dedicated time for individuals to become skilled artists, musicians, healers, and artisans. This allowed for the expression of creativity and the development of practical expertise that might have been stifled or impossible to pursue in the secular world, especially for women or those from less privileged backgrounds. The rich legacy of art, music, and practical knowledge that emerged from these communities is a testament to the opportunities they provided for unleashing human potential. Number 2. Economic independence. More than just pin money. For many people in history, particularly women, economic independence was a distant dream. A woman's financial well-being was typically tied to her father, then her husband, and perhaps later her sons. Marriage often involved the transfer of property through dowries, but direct control over significant economic resources by women themselves was limited. Religious orders, however, could offer a surprising degree of collective economic stability, and for some individuals within them, a form of economic security that was independent of marital status or family wealth. This was far more than just pin money or a small allowance. It was about being part of an economically viable and often powerful institution. Monasteries and convents over centuries often accumulated substantial wealth. This came from various sources: initial endowments from founders, often royalty or wealthy nobles who donated large tracts of land, ongoing gifts of land money and other resources, from pious benefactors seeking spiritual merit, and the productive labor and careful management of the orders themselves. By the High Middle Ages, some religious houses were among the largest landowners in Europe. For example, the Cistercian order, known for its agricultural prowess and its practice of farming remote lands, developed vast estates that were highly productive in wool, grain, and other commodities. Their economic success was built on efficient organization, technological innovation in areas like water management, and the labor of lay brothers and hired workers, as well as the monks themselves. This corporate wealth meant that the community as a whole was economically self-sufficient and often quite prosperous. For an individual joining such an order, this translated into a life free from the anxieties of personal poverty or the need to earn a living in the often precarious secular economy. While individual monks and nuns took vows of personal poverty, meaning they owned nothing themselves, they lived within a community that provided for all their material needs: food, clothing, shelter, and care in sickness and old age. This collective security was a powerful draw, especially for those who lacked personal wealth or family support. For women, this aspect could be particularly significant. The dowry system was a cornerstone of marriage arrangements. A woman without a sufficient dowry might struggle to find a husband or be forced into a less desirable match. While entry into some convents also required a form of dowry or entrance fee, it was often less than what would be required for marriage into a comparable social stratum. Furthermore, some orders, particularly newer mendicant orders or communities like the Beguines, catered to women with fewer resources, or even accepted them without a dowry if they could contribute through their labor or skills. Once inside, a nun was part of an economically stable household, her future secured by the collective resources of the community, not by her ability to attract a husband with a dowry. The leaders of these religious houses, abbots and abbesses, effectively managed large economic enterprises. They were responsible for overseeing agricultural production, leasing lands, collecting rents, managing forests and fisheries, operating mills, and engaging in trade. The accounts of monastic estates reveal complex financial operations and sophisticated management practices. For instance, the records of Bolton Priory in England from the late 13th and early 14th centuries show detailed accounting of income and expenditure related to sheep farming, wool sales, a major export, grain production, and local market activities. Abbesses of wealthy convents, like Shaftesbury or Gandersheim, as mentioned before, controlled economic resources comparable to those of male feudal lords. This provided a sphere for women to exercise significant economic power and administrative skill, roles largely unavailable to them in the secular world outside of widowhood, with strong dower rights. Even for ordinary monks and nuns, participation in the economic life of the community could provide a sense of purpose and contribution. The Benedictine motto, ora et labora, pray and work, underscored the value of manual labor. This work was not just for subsistence, it was part of the spiritual discipline and contributed to the overall well-being and prosperity of the monastery. Whether it was farming, copying manuscripts, which had economic value, weaving, brewing, or managing the infirmary or guest house, each member had a role in the collective enterprise. This contrasted with the situation of, for example, an unmarried woman in a secular household who might be seen as an economic burden if she was not contributing directly through marriage or remunerative work, which was often scarce. Furthermore, some religious orders became involved in specific industries. The Cistercians were pioneers in metallurgy and wool production. Certain monasteries were famous for their wine or beer. This economic activity could make these houses very wealthy and influential players in regional and even international economies. The Knights Templar, a military religious order, developed a sophisticated early banking system, managing funds and transferring money across Europe and the Holy Land. It is true that the wealth of religious orders also became a point of criticism, particularly during periods of reform or social unrest, with accusations of worldliness and departure from ideals of poverty. And eventually, in some countries like England, during the Reformation in the 16th century, this wealth became a target for confiscation by the state. However, for the long centuries during which they flourished, the economic strength of religious orders provided a vital alternative. It offered a life of material security, a chance to contribute to a thriving collective enterprise, and for those in leadership, an opportunity to wield considerable economic power, all independent of the economic constraints and dependencies often associated with marriage and traditional family structures. This economic independence at a communal level was a cornerstone of their ability to offer a distinct way of life. Number 1. Rewriting the script. A life of purpose beyond wife and mother. For much of history, and for many women in particular, the societal script was fairly rigid. Be a wife, become a mother, manage a household. While these roles were, and are, profoundly important and fulfilling for many, they did not encompass the full spectrum of human aspiration or talent. Religious orders offered a radical departure from this script, providing a pathway to a life defined by a different kind of purpose, a purpose rooted in spiritual devotion, intellectual endeavor, service to others, or artistic creations, all within a community that valued these contributions as central to a meaningful existence. This was not just an alternative to marriage. It was an alternative definition of a valuable and purposeful life. In societies where a woman's identity was often subsumed under that of her father or husband, and her primary social value was seen in her reproductive capacity, and her role within the family, joining a religious order was a statement. It was a choice to dedicate one's life to God and to a community of faith, a commitment that often took precedence over familial obligations. This choice could provide a profound sense of agency and self-determination. By taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, individuals were in a sense rewriting their own life stories, choosing a narrative that diverged sharply from the conventional one. Purpose found within religious orders was multifaceted. At its core was the spiritual quest, the pursuit of a closer relationship with God through prayer, contemplation, and adherence to a religious rule. This spiritual purpose was seen as the highest calling, an end in itself. For those who felt this calling deeply, it provided an all-encompassing framework for their lives, imbuing every action, from chanting in the choir to tilling the fields, with sacred meaning. This was a purpose that transcended the mundane and connected individuals to what they believed was eternal and ultimate. Beyond the purely spiritual, religious orders offered avenues for purpose through intellectual and scholarly pursuits. As discussed earlier, monasteries and convents were vital centers of learning, preserving, and creating knowledge. For individuals with a scholarly bent, the opportunity to study, to write, to teach, or to engage in theological debate was a powerful source of purpose. Think of figures like the Venerable Bede in 8th century England, a monk at Jarrow, whose historical and theological writings shaped European thought for centuries. Or Christine de Pizan in the late 14th and early 15th centuries who, though not a nun for most of her writing career, retired to a convent later in life, and whose proto-feminist work, The Book of the City of Ladies, defended women's intellectual and moral capacities, drawing on examples of learned women, including those in religious life. The scriptorium, the library, the schoolroom, these were places where a life of the mind could be pursued with dedication, offering a profound sense of contribution to the intellectual heritage of humanity. Service to others was another key dimension of purpose found in religious life. Many orders were dedicated to charitable works, such as caring for the sick and the poor, providing hospitality to travelers, or educating children. Monks and nuns ran hospitals, almshouses, and schools. The mendicant orders, like the Franciscans and Dominicans who emerged in the 13th century, placed a strong emphasis on preaching, teaching, and ministering to the needs of people in the growing towns and cities. For individuals motivated by compassion and a desire to alleviate suffering, these roles offered a direct and tangible way to make a difference in the world. This was a purpose found not in personal advancement or family building, but in selfless service to the wider community. Artistic and creative expression also provided a deep sense of purpose. Creation of beautiful illuminated manuscripts, the composition and performance of sacred music, the construction of magnificent abbey churches and cathedrals. These were not mere hobbies, but were seen as acts of devotion, ways of glorifying God and uplifting the human spirit. The skill and dedication involved in these artistic endeavors provided a fulfilling outlet for creative talents and left an enduring legacy. For women, the opportunity to live a life of purpose beyond the domestic sphere was particularly huge. In a convent, a woman could be a scholar, a theologian, an administrator, an artist, a musician, or a spiritual leader. She could develop her talents and exercise authority in ways that were rarely possible for her married sisters. The life of an abbess managing a large and complex institution, or a nun renowned for her learning or holiness, offered a model of female achievement and influence that stood outside the traditional patriarchal structures of family and society. This alternative script allowed women to define their worth and their contribution in terms different from those prescribed by conventional gender roles. It's important to recognize that the choice to enter a religious order was not always entirely free, and life within them was not without its own challenges and constraints. However, for many individuals across centuries, these communities offered a unique space to pursue a life of profound meaning and purpose, a life that was not contingent on marriage or procreation. They provided a framework in which spiritual devotion, intellectual growth, service, and creative expression were not just possible, but were the very fabric of daily existence. By offering this alternative, strict religious orders enriched not only the lives of their members, but also the broader culture and society, demonstrating that a life well lived could take many forms. They showed that purpose could be found in many callings, and that the human spirit could flourish in diverse ways, well beyond the confines of a single prescribed path.